Good morning, ADOS and allies. Good afternoon on the East Coast. Good morning on the West Coast. Thank you so much for joining myself and my guest, Marlon Aldridge from Dayton, Ohio. We're here today to talk about the Comcast case. We're going to dig into the New York Times article, and we're also going to keep going on the screen. We're also going to talk about the vote. So I want to thank you so much. Please share this with everyone you know as we go live. And of course, the link will be available after the program. Can they hear me if this is muted? I'm trying to mute those little pop-ups. Okay.
Let me turn it on.
Okay, and we're back. Uh-oh. Yes, so we want to thank you so much for being with us this morning and this afternoon, and we're going to take about an hour of your time to get into this discussion. So much to talk about, so many ADOS hot topics. But let's start first. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with?
Let's start with Comcast.
Okay, let's start with the Comcast case. So we all know, or we're spreading the word about the importance of the Comcast case. It is one of the reasons why we've been asking for ADOS and allies to boycott the Harriet film. Let me just reiterate, in case you haven't read it on my wall, that Focus Features is owned by NBC Universal Studios, which is a subsidiary of Comcast. And so ultimately, Comcast is able to profit yet again, right? Like Harriet Tubman already did her time in slavery. And now this very big, huge corporation, the largest of its kind in the world, is back of this film about our iconic hero, Harriet Tubman. And at the same time, they're seeking to eviscerate our Reconstruction era 1866 civil rights law. And the case is going to the Supreme Court on November the 13th. It's coming up very soon. And this is problematic because we've asked of Comcast to drop this case months ago. We've been trying to appeal to them to drop this case because what's even more problematic than being ultimately the ones to profit from the Harriet film is the fact that of their subscriber base, ADOS is around 40% of their subscriber base. That's huge money going to Comcast. So I'm going to talk about some solutions for when you cancel the Comcast of what you can do to keep your internet going and, just to have some other alternatives with the Fire Stick and a digital antenna. But more of that after we get into this conversation. So Marlon, I'd like to hear from you about the importance of this Comcast case that's coming up. One more point before I let Marlon interject. Byron Allen has already won twice in the Ninth Circuit appellate courts on this issue. He sued them for denying him access to contracts, basically shutting him out of white capital. And this is what they're seeking to do in trying to get a new interpretation of the 1866 civil rights law that benefits everyone, especially major corporations, but Marlon's going to dig more into that. But they're looking to eviscerate this law and to get a different interpretation of it. So with that said, I'm going to have Marlon interject his thoughts about its significance and why we should care and why we should show up to protest on the 13th of November this month, especially if you're in the DMV. Marlon, would you like to add your comments?
Of course. Good morning. First of all, we need to understand that Byron Allen won in the appellate courts. And normally what happens is that the Supreme Court will normally not hear a case that has already been decided by the appellate courts unless it has import to the larger community. And so they decided to hear this case. And what people need to understand is that this case is no longer about Byron Allen, but it is about the larger community. We need to understand those 2 points. Just by virtue of the fact of the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, even taking this case, means that it has importance for all of us. And what the business community in particular is trying to do is to have the same rules apply for racial discrimination cases in employment, to have those same types of standards apply here, namely cause and effect. You probably hear some other terms associated with that. You probably hear the but-for clause. This is supposedly a standard in tort law, which mainly has to do with injuries of the physical type, which it's easier to establish a cause, if you can imagine, for a physical injury. The physical injury is something that you can see, something that you can document, and things of that nature. And generally so they're trying to apply that standard, the standard which typically takes place in physical injury cases, to a case in which there is no physical injury, at least outward, that anyone can see. So that's what's at stake. But
can I stop you there and you give them an example like you shared about the car accident?
Yeah, you can imagine with a car accident, there's a physical injury there that you can see, that you can document by virtue of a police report, having gone to the hospital, being in a wheelchair or something of that nature. It will be easier to establish a direct cause for an accident than it would be to establish an adverse action, say in an employment case. You get fired and that employer basically can make up any kind of argument that's outside of an argument about race. And how will you be able to prove it, especially if there's no written documentation that says that we don't, for instance, hire Black people? And we know that during the segregation era, there were laws on the books. So it would have been easier at that time, after the civil rights legislation of the 60s, to establish discrimination if, in fact, employers, for instance, were still applying laws that were on the books since the Jim Crow era after Reconstruction. So it's a little bit harder to prove those cases now. The laws are no longer on the books. We have the permanent laws and up under the Constitution, which provides protections for us, namely the 14th Amendment would be one example. But I want to extend this discussion on the Byron Allen Comcast case. I want to extend that to a discussion about antitrust laws. And see, we have to understand that first, Comcast is a conglomerate. It is the largest cable provider in the country. We have to understand that first. They own hundreds of companies. So I want you to imagine that here you are, you're protected under the 1866 Civil Rights Law that says that you're able to make and enforce contracts and able to be witness to parties involved with contracts and to argue in a court, and even to have those arguments elevated to the federal level because it was in the states. First of all, we have to understand that the states regulate business and give you license to operate. And so it was the southern states, namely, that were pretty much bilking Black people out of their right to make a living. And so the 1866 Civil Rights Law was actually brought about right after the 13th Amendment to allow newly freed slaves to make a living for themselves, to pass on inheritance, to gain land and other types of assets, which, by the way, happens to do with the claim that ADOS is making, is that those assets that we were not privy to because of discrimination in all of the forms that it has taken since slavery. So also we need to understand is that the Civil Rights Act, which was a general law, was the law that first gave us citizenship. The first part of it said, the first provision said something to the effect that those born in the United States were citizens of the United States and had every right, at least in terms of making and enforcing contracts, that white people had. So it put us on the same footing, at least by law, as that which white people had. So we need to understand that. But I want to come back to this idea of antitrust. The antitrust laws were made to prevent monopolies. And I think that anyone would hardly argue that Comcast is not a monopoly. We need to also find out or be aware that its founder, this company was founded as American Cable Services out of Tupelo, Mississippi. I think that is significant because we know that that is a former slave state, and we know how egregious the state of Mississippi has been in trying to curtail the rights of Black people. So we need to elevate this to a larger scale. And now I want you to understand that if you are a business person of any type, you should be able to engage in free markets. That is a liberal construct we need to understand, as to opposed to monopolistic markets and industries, which Comcast is trying to establish and maintain a monopolistic industry. And from that standpoint, they are able to violate antitrust laws. And in particular, if we go back, corporations were given their power by the same amendment which was meant for slaves, namely the 14th Amendment. So corporations are utilizing the same laws that were meant to protect African Americans.
Thank you for that. And to Marlon's earlier point about, I would just want to go back to the fact that Byron Allen is using his money to protect this right for our sake. I want to dispel this myth that we are acting on Byron Allen's behalf to guarantee his wealth is secured. As I want to reiterate, Byron Allen has won on this issue. He sued AT&T and Comcast in the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court. He prevailed not once but twice. It was Charter. Thank you. He prevailed not once but twice. It was a $20 billion lawsuit. So that's not what Comcast is looking to have undone. That's a done deal. What Byron Allen is doing is expending his own money on top flight attorneys to protect the civil rights law for us. We're the ones that need it. We're the ones who it was designed for after our emancipation in 1865. This came on the heels of that, so that we could have access to the capital that we sold into this country. Our ancestors were the machines, they were the shoes. And we have to understand that what Byron is doing, none of us is in a financial position to do. We can't afford to take this on. Even on a local level, we can't afford to take this on. It costs big money to go up against Comcast at the Supreme Court level, and he's got the help of 6 of Donald Trump's attorneys from the Department of Justice. So let's not disparage Byron Allen. He is ADOS, and he's an ally. So let's not disparage him in this way. I also want to talk about the importance of, you said the owner or the founder of Comcast being from Tupelo, Mississippi.
Yes.
Understand the correlation between that and how the vote is being suppressed down in the South. You have to understand what is happening, family. They are trying to deny us access to it all when we built this. So Marlon, I'd like for you, because we've kind of touched on this in conversation, I want you to talk about the vote and how much it really sticks that we have built this. I want you to support and undergird when we say hashtag we built this. Let's go there first. When we say hashtag we built this, can you please expound on all the truth inherent in that hashtag?
Sure. Not only did we help make the United States the wealthiest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, but our struggle undergirds all citizens. And what I mean by that is, for example, the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. The 13th Amendment is used today in the context of sex trafficking. That's been a big deal throughout the United States and actually throughout the world. But that law is actually used in federal courts, for instance, to prosecute people that engage in sex trafficking, for example. And then, of course, we know that that same law has also been used to undergird and support the private prison industrial complex. I'll use the 14th Amendment as another example. Corporations have used the 14th Amendment to claim that they are people and therefore citizens, and have the same rights as you and I do from the standpoint of individuals. And that has allowed them to become very powerful. We have to remember during the Second Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, if you're familiar with your history, the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and so forth became very powerful. So antitrust laws became very prominent during that time. Basically, what they were doing is they were buying up companies, coming together as a trust, and basically dominating the markets in the industries in which they were a part of. So how is that important to Byron Allen or any business person? Let's take this out of the realm of Byron Allen. Let's say if you are in the entertainment industry and you provide content, you produce TV shows and things and movies and things of that nature, but you're unable to distribute your movies. You will never make any money. And your return on investment, you won't have it because you've basically been shut out of the markets. So Comcast is a conglomerate. It is a trust of businesses in the hundreds, maybe even thousands. I'm not sure about the numbers, but I know in the hundreds of businesses, and they are the largest cable provider in the United States. So here you have an African-American, Byron Allen, who owns numerous TV stations, content, but is unable to distribute them to the larger market, including the African-American market. So that is very significant for business owners from the standpoint of creating wealth. Imagine having a product or service and no market to distribute it in. So that's basically what we are seeing here. Contracts also have to do with rental agreements and leases, apartment leases, for a matter of fact. And so it has import there as well. So we have to understand that if Comcast gets its way and the business community gets its way, it's going to change racial discrimination claims. Lawyers will not be willing to take those cases because they will have less evidence that they can operate with, and that evidence will be at least their problem will be trying to convince a judge or a jury that an adverse action was strictly because or solely because of race. And we can imagine what kind of hurdle that would be, because no defendant is going to admit that they made a decision, an adverse action, because of race. They will simply use some other neutral argument as to why an adverse action they engaged in some type of adverse action. So we need to understand that.
Thank you so much for that, Marlon. Okay, so I also want to talk, I think this is a good time to transition into the vote. Many of you already know that I've come up with a strategy to support Marianne Williamson because she's the only candidate in this race that speaks from the chest about our repair. And this isn't something new for her. She wrote a book about this back in, well, not exclusively about this, Healing the Soul of America. I think it's Healing the Heart and Soul of America back in '97. And reparations was mentioned there. And she's been going all over the country, ringing the alarm about our repair and doing what she's supposed to do, which is educating white people on our history. Because when history was changed in this country, it's not just impacting us, but it's impacting, white folks as well. They don't know the truth about us having built this country. Even Donald Trump recently gave us credit for having built the country. Of course, he didn't back it up with any package of repair. And I doubt very seriously the Republicans will repair us. But the bottom line is we have to understand the significance between our contribution in this country and how all these efforts are being made to silence us, even down to lying on us as not showing up to the polls to vote. So back to my earlier point, my strategy is to support Marianne Williamson because she is the only candidate to talk full-chested about reparations. Now, I know her numbers aren't what we want them to be. I know that, but what I do know is that she's intending to have Dr. Sandy Darity, Duke professor and lead economist, especially, he's an ally, and he's ADOS. He is with us. We're fighting and working together. She is planning on having him on her council. Now, I doubt that she'll win the primary. My whole strategy has everything to do with sending a strong message to the establishment candidate that will be chosen, irrespective of how we vote. That we are about these reparations and a Black agenda, or we're going to show up to the polls and vote down. So I'm saying to leverage her sound on the reparations to our advantage by putting the weight of our vote behind her during the primary to send a message simply to the establishment candidate running for the Democratic Party. Let me stop right there and have Marlon jump in and interject the reasons why he's opposed to that strategy. Give us your perspective.
Well, let me provide some context first, and I want to provide a quote from Nicholas Stephanopoulos, assistant professor, University of Chicago Law School. And I'm going to read his quote. It says, at both the federal and local levels, Blacks hold much less sway than whites. And for example, a federal policy with no white support has only a 10% chance of being enacted, while one with universal white support has a 60% shot of adoption. But while a proposal with no Black support has a 40% chance of becoming law, one enjoying unanimous approval has only a 30% probability of enactment. In other words, as support for a policy rises within the Black community, the odds of it being achieved actually decline. And the same is true for women. The more women or minorities support a particular piece of legislation, the less of a chance it has of being enacted. That's number one. And then my second contention, and this is just a personal preference, I don't like supporting anything weak. And Marianne Williamson's white people don't even support Marianne Williamson. I think she's less than 0.5% in the polls, and I don't support anything weak. That's just a personal preference on my part. And I noticed that whites who've been ostracized from their own communities tend to look for support within the Black community. From those two standpoints, well, actually the second standpoint, the first point was just for context. It's just a personal preference of mine. Whether or not it's a larger movement, that's really not important to me. It's just a personal preference, at least from my standpoint.
Okay, so even though nobody else is talking about reparations, because she's a weak candidate, in your personal opinion, the reparations can't supersede your personal opinion about her in order to invoke a strategy that could get the establishment candidate to pay attention to what we're seeking?
Well, there's some other points, but I think we have to stay, our objectives has to be first and foremost. I actually think that there's an opportunity for Black people to make up a larger, significant portion of Congress. I don't know what the theoretical limit is. I know right now we represent about 10%, 12% of Congress. There are 55 elected officials in Congress at this time out of 435. Imagine what would happen if we could approach 100 Black elected officials who are down with and support our agenda items. That would have a lot of sway in Congress, because what we first have to understand is we live in a political economy in which the majority rules. Until we have significant numbers at both the state, actually we can include the local level, we don't do so bad there, but at the state level, we don't control anything. And of course, at the federal level, we don't control anything. So we don't rule anything. And we have to understand what happens when the majority party takes over the federal government. Let's provide some more context to understand why we have to change our strategies. Over the last 26 years, for example, the Republicans have controlled Congress. I'm talking about I'm talking about the federal government. I am talking about they have controlled the federal government 18 years out of the last 26. I'm talking about control of the Senate and control of the House. Now, on the presidential side, it's about split. The Democrats have only controlled the House and the Senate 6 times. Okay, so we're talking about the Republicans have basically dominated control of the federal government, and they also have trifectas in about 22 states, as opposed to the Democrats' 16. What do I mean by that? They control the governorship, they control the Senate and the House in 22 states, while the Democrats have trifectas in only 16 states. So over the last 26 years, the Republicans have pretty much dominated federal government. So this makes the Democratic Party weak. So the Democratic Party is dependent upon blacks who have the largest voter turnout. We need to understand this. I'm hearing a lot of ADOS claim that blacks do not turn out to vote, and that is a myth. If you look at other minorities, they don't come close. And as a matter of fact, in 2012, when Hillary Clinton was running, black people, for the first time that records were being kept, turned out in greater numbers than white people did. Okay, so we have to understand this. People will generally turn out to vote for people who look like them. Except for black folks, we do it at a larger rate than most other people do. So we need to understand that. We turned out for large numbers for Barack Obama, and we turned out more than anyone else for Hillary Clinton. So we need to understand that. I have some statistics on that as too. I'm gonna let you take over while I find these statistics.
Okay. To Marlon's point, it is, I want to add that we showed up in greater numbers for Hillary Clinton than white people. I just want to reiterate that. And having worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, I understand clearly why. There was white outrage over the fact that the establishment colluded with Hillary Clinton to guarantee her the primary. The superdelegates were voting for Hillary despite the constituent vote. Now, I don't have all of the statistics of where that was occurring, but working on that campaign, I was privileged to a lot of the nonsense that was happening in that primary. And I'm here to tell you, this is what goes under the radar and how we get easily blamed for not showing up and doing our part in greater numbers than they do. So let me be the first to tell you, if Trump wins, it's not because of ADOS. Okay, the ADOS movement is small in proportion to how we're seeking to grow. And right now, it appears that the majority of ADOS people, their priority is unseating Trump as compared to reparations. We're still working as a movement to convince our own that reparations is a debt that they are owed. But let me go back. So please understand that it was the progressives that are going to make or break this thing for Trump. If they don't like who the DNC chooses, whether we vote for them or not is inconsequential. They've done it before. I already see some makings of this with the debates, how they're working to silence the anti-war rhetoric coming out of from Tulsi Gabbard, and how they don't want reparations on that stage either. So I don't understand how Amy Klobuchar and some of these others are still hanging in there. But I feel that there is a bigger effort to keep those things out of the conversation. But do know this about those Bernie supporters, especially given that they've raised more money than all of the people allegedly polling higher than him, like a Biden or an Elizabeth Warren. I don't believe the polls, okay? But you can trust and believe if they screw Bernie out of this election, prepare for Trump, because they are the reason Trump is in office. We're always the ones that they want to put on the chopping block to take the blame for why things go wrong. We're always the ones the Democratic Party turns to bail them out of all of their fires. White folks put Trump into office, but now it becomes our vote that they want so desperately without an exchange. They want our vote without an exchange like they've been doing for 60 years. We've been the mules of the Democratic Party, and they're doing everything to do in their power to disparage us as the ADOS movement because we're making noise and we're not just sitting down, rolling over and taking this nonsense anymore. We're making demands. So since folks want to say, well, the last election cycle, when you didn't make any demands of Obama. Yes, we did. But he gave us Valerie Jarrett and gave us the door, put us out in the snow. So I'm here to tell you it's a different election. And if Trump wins, don't come for us. Don't come for the ADOS movement. Because those people that support Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, they're not voting for Biden. They may vote for Elizabeth Warren. I don't know that it'll be enough. Marlon.
On the Bernie Sanders case, a couple of things. There was an article that came out. I can't remember which newspaper, but it basically said that even if all of the allotted slots of superdelegates voted for Bernie Sanders, he would have still lost by significant numbers. So I'm seeing a lot of people talk about the superdelegates, but the fact of the matter is, if those superdelegates, if all of them had voted for Sanders, and they did not, he would have still lost. Okay, the fact of the matter is that and this is just my personal opinion, I do not believe that the mainstream is ready to elect a Jewish person. There is a pecking order in the United States. We need to understand that. We live in a patriarchal system where the white man is on top. Okay, I'm talking about at least politically. And in my opinion, I'm open to arguments on this or debate. The black man is second. That's why Barack Obama was able to become president. The white woman would be third, and sadly, the black woman would be fourth, although she participates at a higher rate than any of the groups do. That's just my personal opinion on it. I don't believe Bernie Sanders, I don't believe that America is ready for a Bernie Sanders. The verdict is still out on a white woman. We know that white women during the 2012 campaign with Hillary Clinton did not vote for Hillary Clinton. So in significant or larger or numbers that we would have expected them to vote for, because they understand the pecking order and believe in the traditional society. We have to understand what conservatism means. Conservatism, you can replace it with the term traditional society. And that traditional European-based society is a patriarchal system. And of course, if you are a religious person, you probably understand that as well. A woman is supposed to submit herself to her husband. So sometimes we have to understand, in order to understand current behavior, we have to look at history. Okay, so it's important for us to go far back, even far back in history, to understand the way society was set up and then bring that forward, because that predicts what happens today by knowing what happened in the past. It's very important for us to understand that. Secondly, I think I misspoke on the 2012 election. Let me correct what I said so that there's no misunderstanding. Black people on the whole showed up in larger numbers than any other group. We need to understand that. And I want to make a comparison with Hispanics, because there's this talk that Hispanics will have a larger turnout than African Americans in the 2020 election. Let me give you the 2016 numbers. And these are people that are eligible to vote. I'm talking about 18 years and older. Let's start with Hispanics, 38.9 million Hispanics. That's the population. Total citizens, 26.7 million. Total non-citizens then, 12.3 million. For those of you that if that's important, then that's a number that you need to be aware of. Total citizens who voted, 12.7 million. That's percentage of the population registered to vote. Now, here's the numbers that really are important. The comparisons are the most important. Percentage of population registered to vote, 39.2%. Percentage of population who voted, 32.5%. Now, here's the blacks. Total population that's eligible to vote, 30.6 million. Total citizens, 28.8 million. Total non-citizens, 1.8 million. Percentage, total citizens who voted, 17.1 million. Now, let's contrast that with Hispanics, 12.7 million compared to 17.1 million. In terms of percentages, percentage of population registered to vote, 65.3%. Percentage of population who voted, 55.9%. That's 55.9%. And that's over 20 percentage points higher than what Hispanics voted. Now let's look at the total percentage of the total U.S. population, percentage of population, U.S. population, eligible age to vote was 56%. So our numbers are keeping with the national average. We need to understand that. Unlike other minorities. Now, other groups are catching up. Hispanics say so. I think they have about 50 legislators in the current Congress.
How many do we have?
As opposed to our 55. So they are catching up from that standpoint. I think as a strategy that we need to push the envelope. We don't necessarily have to be in a voting district that is all black, because there are whites that are willing to vote for the black candidate. And as a matter of fact, I think I need to disabuse some ADOS of this position here concerning the Congressional Black Caucus. They represent 49% of us. Okay? Somewhere 46 to 49% of us. My major point is this. If they only represent 46 to 49% of us, who do you think the other people are that they represent? Those are non-black people. Okay, so we need to think about that when we consider what the Congressional Black Caucus does. They not only represent black folks, they represent non-black people as well. Let me go back to Obama. It's important to us to understand this. It's going to have to do with the domination that the Republicans have had over the Democratic Party, and thus the federal government and even the state governments during Obama's years as well as Clinton years. The Republicans were in control of the House and the Senate for 6 of 8 years under both Clinton and Obama. At least in the case of Clinton, they were able to compromise. Of course, the Republicans had the advantage. So I look at it from this standpoint. Bill Clinton was promoting a Republican agenda. Let's jump forward to Obama. Mitch McConnell says, I don't support anything that you support. And that is in concert with the research from the Stephanopoulos out of Carnegie Mellon University, who did the research that said that whatever black people support in mass numbers, white people or white Congress people do not support. So Obama was not able to compromise because the Republicans would not allow him to compromise. So during his tenure, the Republicans were in control 6 out of 8 of those years. They were in control of the House and the Senate. So we need to understand that the Democratic Party is weak and we need to make them heal. Okay? I want to provide another example of how the Democratic Party has to play a balancing act. In other words, they can't look too pro-Black. And we saw evidence of that in Katrina, in which Nancy Pelosi, I'm talking about Hurricane Katrina, didn't want to have hearings on Katrina because she didn't want to appear to be too pro-Black. So we have that going against us, where even the Democratic Party, who has to balance those numbers with minorities and with whites, can't outwardly support us because that will turn off or dissuade white voters. So really, at least in my estimation, the only strategy that we have is to gain a larger number of representatives in Congress. Now, in the states, it will be problematic because unless we're in the southern states, but there's an issue in the southern states too, Angie, I think we need to talk about, but I'm gonna let you interject where you want to interject and sort of guide us where we need to go next.
Okay, don't forget that point. Don't forget the point you're about to make.
I've forgotten.
See, I knew that was going to happen.
It was about the Southern.
I think you're about to go into the Southerners and the vote and how.
You want me to go into that, or do you want to take it somewhere else?
I want you to finish that thought, because I think you were going someplace really solid with the vote in the South and how it's being suppressed. Okay. I think you're about to turn there based on your.
Okay, it's important for us to understand this. 55% of the Black electorate resides in the southern states. There are about 11 southern states. There are about, don't quote me on the numbers, but I think there are about 11 southern states. In the presidential election, now this applies to the presidential elections only. Black people who live in the South, that's 55% of the Black electorate, do not choose the president. They are effectively disenfranchised in the South. And a lot of us don't know that. So we're telling people to get out to vote, but you can get out to vote all you want to in the South for the president, and it isn't going to make a difference unless white people are willing to vote for the same presidential candidate that you're willing to vote for. And I can tell you that you're not. They're going to vote for the Republican. And the irony is that after the Civil War, the southern states were Democratic states. And since Jimmy Carter, they have voted Republican. They are now red states. And here's the reason that Blacks in the South are disenfranchised in presidential elections. It was established way back at the writing of the original Constitution. It's called the Electoral College. And more specifically, we're talking about the winner takes all system. It's important for us to understand the winner take all system. First of all, the Electoral College is determined from the census. It has to do with population, and the number of representatives that you will have in the House is determined by the census. Each state will have 2 senators. So even if you have a small state, if you live in a small state, you have a larger percentage of control by living in a larger state than you would in a state like California, because each state gets 2 senators regardless of their population. So it's important for us to understand that. But here's the larger point. In presidential elections, you must win the majority in each state. I'm talking about you must win 51% of the vote. the candidate that wins 51% of the vote gets all of the electoral college votes. Let me say that again. In a presidential election, you must win 51% of the state vote, or the candidate who wins 51% of the state vote gets all of the electoral college votes. So what that means is that if you are a Republican candidate and you get 51% of the vote, which you have since the days of Jimmy Carter back in the 70s, black votes did not count for all intents and purposes, or you can say they went to the Republican candidate. Now that's 55% of the black electorate. Okay, so blacks are really only significant in what I refer to the swing states. Now, to be honest, the same is true, can be said for white folks, but we understand that at least in the southern states, white citizens vote as a block, and they will vote for the Republican candidate. So we talk about voter suppression and gerrymandering. This is something that's outside of the realm, not really outside of the realm of gerrymandering, because those number of electors is determined by those congressional districts. In addition to once the population is determined, the number of representatives in the House is determined by the population counts. So it's important for us to understand that. And what's very significant as well, in places like Mississippi, blacks represent over 30% of the population. So you can imagine having a large representation in the population, but being unable to elect a president because your numbers are not greater than the white vote. So it's important for us to understand that 55% of the black electorate is shut out from picking a president.
Wow. So it appears to me like not only do we have to get rid of the superdelegates, we've got to get rid of the Electoral College.
That's been a proposal to have a national vote. That has been a proposal, and we have to understand why the Electoral College was set up in the first place, and even why we have two chambers in Congress. This had to do, and to a large extent, around the issue of slavery, and the smaller states having less of a vote than the larger states. And the South, of course, wanted to maintain, which was Democratic, by the way, the South wanted to maintain the institution of slavery. So a lot of what we see in terms of how Congress was set up and the Electoral College was a compromise between northern states and southern states, so that the southern states would maintain some semblance of power by having a Senate, right? And even the issue around counting slaves as 3/5 of a person. And the aspect of it, the Electoral College too, was advantageous to southern states.
Okay. I see you, family, in the chat, and we're definitely going to take your questions. I think we're going to go over just a little bit today, since some of you guys are just popping in, and I want to really put a button and a nice bow on this conversation so that you'll share it. I want to go back to something you said earlier when you were giving the statistics of the Hispanic versus the Black vote. I want to ask, what impact will opening the borders for illegal immigration have on the vote? Because it appears to me that that's part of the Democratic strategy, is to flood us with immigrants so that they can increase the vote, since they believe, unakin to your statistics, they also push that narrative that we don't show up to vote. Since they believe they're losing the Black vote, it appears to me and many ADOS that they're opening these borders so that they could increase their voter base and pretty much replace us as a voter base. Could you expound on your thoughts about that? And yes, go ahead.
Well, I don't think they're trying to replace us as a voter base because, like we said, the 14th Amendment gave us permanent citizenship. So you can't replace us. That's not what they're trying to do. As I've said earlier, is that...
Stop right there, please. Can you, I don't know that the audience knows that the 14th Amendment gave us permanent citizenship. Can you?
Well, actually, it was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which gave us citizenship. It basically said, the first provision of it said something to the effect that any person born here is a citizen. Okay, but that was a general law. The amendments to the Constitution are permanent laws. So they took, the Republicans, by the way, took that provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and placed it into the 14th Amendment, which requires a 2/3 vote in the House. In the Senate, it has to be approved by the president, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that is anything that is in the Constitution, the original Constitution and the 27 amendments, there is a higher threshold to change those laws. So the Republicans at the time wanted to make sure that newly freed slaves had certain rights. And so they took the provisions, at least the first provision that had to do with citizenship, they took that from the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which came, by the way, right after the 13th Amendment in 1865. So that's what we mean by that in terms of the citizenship part. But the Republicans, like I said, it's easy to understand what they're doing. They have been losing power since the Lyndon Johnson days.
Republicans do?
The Democrats have been losing power since the days of Lyndon Baines Johnson and Richard Nixon. Interestingly enough, that when Richard Nixon came into office, there was a democratically controlled House and Senate. And so we can imagine the scandal up under the Nixon administration because he was in a Congress that was controlled by the Democrats. And we see that sort of resonant today. Donald Trump has taken it to another level and has become more corrupt and is engaging in more corrupt behavior than even Richard Nixon did. But at least in my opinion, Richard Nixon is the spawn of the low down, dirty Republicans that we see today. A lot of them that we saw in the two Bush administrations were people that were also a part of the Nixon administration, or at least were tangent to it. I'll give an example. Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News, was the marketing consultant for Richard Nixon. In my opinion, I like to refer to Richard Nixon as the spawn of Satan, namely these low down, dirty Republicans that you see today that are trying to undermine the Constitution and take us back to the traditional society. People hear me use the term feudal lords. We're talking about the feudal system and how society was set up then. And at least in my opinion, we see some of that going on today. We have a Congress set up that is supposedly against an absolute monarch. But when you look at these traditionalists, these conservatives, what you see them is actually promoting a monarch, in this case, a moronic, corrupt, depraved monarch in the case of Donald John Trump. So it's important for us to understand that they're trying to turn back the hands of time. And this Civil Rights Act of 1866 is going to be part of that. A lot of what we see happening there has to do with equity courts. We're talking about tort law, injury cases, personal injury cases, and things of that nature, trying to apply the same standard there as we are in racial discrimination cases. And it's going to turn everything upside down and definitely take us back to a point where we are less than what sharecroppers were. So it's important for us to get behind, or at least be aware of, to talk to our Congress people. I understand that Bobby Rush has come out in support of against Comcast. That is, we need to understand that the Department of Just Us came out with an amicus brief, basically saying the same thing that I'm saying today, is that we should apply the same standards to this case, i.e. The enforcement of contracts. We should apply the same standards that we apply in tort law to these particular type of arrangements. And what I'm saying is that the larger import is that Comcast is engaging in monopolistic business practices, limiting competitive competition. And for those of us business people that have products and services, it's going to be harder for you to bring those products and services to market if you do not have the distribution to do it. So that's one of the possible outcomes of this, is that you will be shut out in the same way that many African countries are shut out from particular markets, even though you have products and services that are in demand. It's important for us to understand that.
I want to go back. Thank you for that. I want to go back to the impact of the immigrants and the vote. I'm trying to go up to see what Joelle said. She made a comment about how it's no real threat. I want to, oh, Lord, this thing freezes on me. She says, Joelle says the Hispanics are not a real threat at this time. The Cubans in Miami have directed public policy in Florida for decades. Thus, they are as disjointed as our community. To state that they are organized and rallying together for political power is a fallacy. However, on the local levels is where they dominate. The Hispanic Latino understand that all politics are local. It's more important to have local control than national. Would you like to speak on what Joelle commented?
Well, that to a large extent is true because of the way the federal government is set up. We're in terms of federalism, that has to do with power sharing between the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments. This has always been from the very beginning the idea of power sharing. That's why you're seeing some of the local cities, especially the larger cities, sort of flexing their muscle from the standpoint of sanctuary cities. But we've seen in many examples where the state has come in to trump what city governments have done. And even the federal government has, in some cases, tried to trump, no pun intended, what local governments have done, for example, in attempts to withhold federal funding from local municipalities. The state, like I said, will sometimes intervene in the governance of municipalities. I know here, at least in Dayton, I know there was a requirement by the city, an ordinance by the city that said that if you were a city employee that you had to reside in the city, and the state ended up overturning that ordinance. And what we find now is that a lot of people that actually work in city government actually live outside of the city government. And that's an issue for us, especially from the standpoint of policing, because the people that are patrolling our neighborhoods are not from those neighborhoods, and so they don't understand the people that live in those particular communities, and we get what we get. We get political persecution of African Americans in particular.
Okay, thank you for that. But a couple of my fam in the chat is saying that they're trying to replace our voter base with the illegal immigrants, that the Democrats want to open these borders and allow them in. Can you speak to whether or not they're accurate in their assessment that
they're not
seeking to replace?
I don't understand the issue of trying to replace us. That's nonsensical to me. If we understand the fact, first of all, we have to understand the context. The Democratic Party has, in terms of numbers, they have better statistics than anyone. And they understand that the immigrants that are coming into these countries, they're coming into Republican strongholds. Okay, in the Southwest, we're talking about places like Nevada and Arizona, and even Washington, for that matter. We're looking at a lot of immigration in those particular areas, and these particular immigrants have a tendency to vote Democratic, along Democratic lines. So no, they're not trying to replace us. They simply have not been able to control the federal government over the last 26 years because the majority population, white folks, tend to be more conservative and tend to align more with conservative or Republican values, even if they are independents. And I like to joke with some of my black my black independent friends who say that they're independent, but when you look at the policies that they support, they happen to align with the Republican Party. So I'll say that they are Republicans disguising themselves as independents. So it's not about trying to replace us, it's trying to get the electorate to a level where they can dominate the federal government like they did up until the time of Bill Clinton.
Okay. Roland Dunham says they are trying to replace us. They're offering them free health care. Stop playing, bro. That's a tangible vote to me. What do you think?
Well, I've heard these arguments, but when we look at the law, a lot of these federal programs have to do with citizenship. So there are some cases we will not deny health care, for example, to anyone that needs it. But in terms of in terms of the law, this just happens not to be the case. And we can go out and we can do some research on that. I think a lot of us tend to just repeat Republican talking points, but we need to understand that the Republicans understand what the Democrats are trying to do in terms of trying to increase their voter base. And they will use any attempt whatsoever to try to convince the American public that what the so-called liberal Democrats, what they're doing is antithetical to traditional American values. Ultimately, what this is about is maintaining white power and thus white supremacy. This is ultimately what this is about. And so I think we need to be a little bit more cognizant, do our research, find out what we are entitled to as citizens, and basically to make sure that we aren't spreading disinformation. So a lot of this is just disinformation.
Okay, Shamika Andrews, good morning, says they don't want to have to depend on us to remain in power. They are hoping that immigrants will become their primary base. And you've already addressed why you don't agree with that statement, as has Joelle. Joelle says, Roland says they are willing to spend unlimited on healthcare, but only $500 billion on reparations. Stop playing. Let me address that. The number from Dr. William Sandy Darity, Duke professor and lead economist, is 17 trillion. So no, we're not settling. We have to get this right. We're not going to settle for the crumbs on the table. We're talking about not just in the trillions, but over multi-generations, we will receive our checks. So they're not going to pay, it in a lump sum. But if it took 400 some odd years to drive us into a ditch, it's going to probably take at least half that or a little bit more to make us whole. We're talking about closing the racial wealth gap in this country. And no one else has presented anything as plausible as reparations to do that. So we will get our repair. Don't stress, but understand this, family. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And that's why we need you guys' support to grow this movement. If we can get half of us, half of ADOS on board with this, which is probably like about 20 million of us, we will be able to move this. But it's going to take us to agree that this is a debt that is owed before we can convince white people that it is a debt that is owed. So we're here like a silent drumbeat to guarantee that. Joelle says, we are the conservatives in this country. However, the persons running the country are so blatantly racist. We haven't been able to find a firm footing within the Republican Party. I am a Democrat because of the Democratic tenets. I totally disagree with both of you. The whole healthcare thing is about recreating a servant class of citizens. Okay, let me go back to Joelle's point because we're going to have to sign off. We're at 10:15. When she talks about, let me back up to what Joelle said earlier. Some will disagree with me, but it's important for ADOS to be on both sides of the aisle. It's dangerous to be monolithic as it relates to politics. Marlon, would you like to share your views? I kind of like what she's saying.
Okay,
personally.
There's a lot of we've all heard the term, the phrase that we have to choose from the worst of two evils. We have to pick from the worst of two evils. And I don't think that people recognize that this is an academic phrase based on the evidence, based on a scan of history. And I think that history is important. We have to understand, at least Black people do. We have to understand that, first of all, we were brought here as slaves to build this country. We were brought here because we had to know how to cultivate in a semi-aromatic environment. And so that's one of the reasons that we were brought here. We're also brought here because if we look back even in European history, under the days of the Romans, 25% of the population there were chattel slaves. So this isn't something that's unique to African Americans. These Europeans, namely the Germans, the French, the British, the Italians, are looking at what has been done traditionally in their societies. And that's why we have a patriarchal system. That's why the idea of chattel slavery, the idea of tenant farming or sharecropping, these are all constructs that were utilized in the previous years, namely the classical or ancient times, and then, of course, the medieval period. We can go back through any one of those areas and we will see semblances of what we see today. If you even look from the standpoint of politics, if we go back to Rome, only the men who had served in the military could vote. So we see the military being highly significant in these traditional European societies. Even from the standpoint, if we move forward into the feudal system, what we saw is that people being granted land in return for service, i.e. military service. In other words, they had to fight for the monarch at that particular time. So it amazes me sometimes that Black people aren't able to predict what white people are doing when the history is there that pretty much informs us as to why they do what it is that they do. So it is no surprise to me, and whenever I want to get an understanding of what white people are doing, I need look no further than their history. In terms of what we should do, I think that is important. We live in a society in which majority rules. We have to first understand that. Number two, we have to understand that whether you're on the Democratic side or the Republican side, no one wants to lose power. So it sort of amazes me that we would think that white people would allow Hispanics to come in and replace them, because when we look back at history, we find that white folks have a very strong sense of ethnocentrism. And what I mean by that is that they feel that they are superior to folks, and they're just not going to let another ethnic group rule over them. How do I know this? Is because if we look back at European history, we will find that white folks, these European ethnic groups, let me name them off for you so that you know, the largest ethnic group in Europe are the Russians. So it shouldn't amaze anyone today that the second largest ethnic group in Europe, the Germans, would want to reconcile themselves with the Russians. Our president, Donald Trump, is of German descent. So it's not surprising to me that he would try to align himself with the largest ethnic group in Europe, which are the Russians. Both of them have traditional systems, have lived up under a feudal system. Both the Russians and some of the other groups in Europe have lived up under this type of system. And what we see is a reformation of that system in the United States. I like to refer to it as a reformed feudal system. Patriarchy is maintained. The rich folks, the multinational corporations are now the barons of old. We still have a strong military, and those who serve in the military are looked at and regarded very highly. The women are still on the bottom, and of course, the ethnic groups outside of European ethnic groups are on the bottom. And of course, that system is maintained today, and I don't see it changing anytime soon because the apple never falls far from the tree.
And with that said, do you believe that we can work on both sides of the aisle, as Joel suggested?
I don't see
as ADOS being in both parties. Do you think that we can ever work together in harmony, given how different our tenets are?
And that's where the problem lies. And then we should look for, I think another mistake we make is that we never look at models that have proven effective. And I can't find a place where that model has proven effective. I've seen, for example, we see a lot of groups aligning themselves along the lines of either Republican or Democratic or maybe even independent in terms of the super PACs. I think that's important for us to understand. And the political action committees, these are normally aligned with one of the particular parties. And the reason that is so is because we are highly polarized now. we're highly polarized, and there's some measures, congressional measures that they use to measure political polarity in the United States, and we're up in the 80, 90 percentile in terms of legislation that occurs along political parties. So trying to institute something new, I don't think is a wise thing, because the models that are out there now do not support that type of strategy, trying to straddle both sides, because you can't serve two masters. We've heard that in our churches. You can't serve two masters, and the same is true in the political system.
And one last comment I'd like to touch on from Yolanda Niels. Good morning. If we're approaching reparations as a justice claim, don't we need to be in court pursuing it versus politics in order to recoup the loss?
100%. 100%. Of course, this was codified at the federal level, so they are the main litigants, but that does not excuse the corporations. That does not even exclude the ecumenical society, namely the Catholic Church. All of these institutions were involved in slavery. We're talking about the universities as well. All of them are potential litigants. So I'm in 100% agreement with that. We need to go after all of them. But at the same time, we need to try to increase our numbers in Congress. And we need to broach any theoretical limit, whatever it is. I'm thinking that we can control 25% of Congress if we work smartly. And so we need to play chess, not checkers. And I think this ideal of just voting and not knowing whom we're voting for and not having a strategy is playing chess. So I think we need to elevate our game.
That's playing checkers.
Playing checkers. Thank you for correcting me on that. But we need to play chess and not checkers. And we need to be dressed as aggressive as the mainstream is in trying to promote our interests. We need to be just as aggressive as Hispanics. And we need to understand, most importantly, that what we have on our side is a large database of history, which helps us, which informs us, and which allows us to predict exactly what is going to happen, what the opponent is going to do. He is going to do what he has traditionally done. We need to quit guessing. We need to quit buying into these liberal constructs of egalitarianism and all of these other types of things that European liberals have promoted, because when it's all said and done, a person will always go back to what they have done in the past, and what they have done in the past is to maintain their dominance. No one wants to give up their power. Until we understand that and begin to utilize the same modes of thinking that others use, that we are going to be in the predicament that we're in, and it's not going to get any better. And we're going to see many other groups surpass us, and we're just going to fall further and further behind.
Thank you. Corbett Dumas says, do you have a YouTube channel? Not yet, but I'm working on it. I want to be able to go live on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at the same time. But I have to study on how to do that. So thank you for your interest in a YouTube channel. It's definitely coming, and these prior videos will be uploaded and archived there as soon as I figure it out. Joelle says, please watch Frontline's episode on Al and what's that? Al in China. I don't know what Al means.
AI. I think that's AI.
AI in China. There is so much at stake. America is on the edge of collapse. Our enemy is no longer racism in America, but on a global scale. White people are in trouble. We shouldn't be concerned about them at all. We need our check because the Chinese are here. I'm not worried about Latinos and Hispanics. Our enemy is the Far East. Would you like to add some insight to that? Or?
That's a Republican talking point. How you doing, Joel? That's a Republican talking point. If we look at global white supremacy, your standpoint, you are correct from this standpoint, and that the current administration and the global white supremacists, and even the liberals for that matter, I need to be honest about this one, and even the Democrats for this matter, know that China is a rising threat. And personally, what I see is a realignment of the former European powers. Trump is the face of it. He doesn't quite know. I'm not sure if he knows what the intent is, but he's the face. The president is a face, a propaganda agent. And what he is trying to do is to realign Russia with the United States. He is trying to destabilize the European Union, right? He is trying to destabilize NATO. NATO was set up to defend against the former Soviet Union. We need to understand that. China engages in military exercises with Russia. Russia borders China. We need to understand this, and you are 100% correct from the standpoint is that China is trying to position itself as a global power. Okay, so when we see Trump doing what he's trying to do, he is fulfilling the agenda of global white supremacy. He's trying to realign, not according to your political system, but he's trying to realign from the standpoint of maintaining white dominance around the world. And the Russians, who are a military threat, at least from the standpoint of nuclear weapons, right? Can you imagine what would happen if the United States realigned itself with Russia, two of the largest stockpilers of nuclear weapons, or the two largest stockpilers of nuclear weapons in the world? Imagine what kind of threat that would be to an emerging China. So a lot of what we're seeing is a return to what I like to refer to as the feudal system, where nationalism was very prominent during that time. And in particular, after that, we saw two world wars result because of nationalistic tendencies. And we saw the world try to reestablish itself via NATO, via the United Nations. This was what we refer to as what some of the Republicans, and especially the global white supremacists, refer to as universalism. This ideal of crossing across national borders and acting as a fraternity. And these former European feudal lords are against that. They want to maintain their national borders. They want to maintain their culture and their way of life. And so what we see is a return to that. So we're seeing a return to nationalism, which was the cause of two world wars. So people need to understand that if these folks get their ways, what will likely happen is that we will be engaged in a third world war as these nations, these highly ethnocentric nations, begin to flex their muscle and want to control the Earth's resources. What we will see is a return to pre-World War I era, okay, and even before, in which nationalism was king. So I don't want to be a part in that, because there is an opportunity, or at least a potentiality, of a war being fought on the American soil if there is another world war. And of course, we don't want to be any party to that. So that's just my take on that. I think we need to look at what's going on in Britain, This example of BRICS. BRICS is another example of Britain wanting to disengage themselves from the European Union after gaining admission, I think, in the 60s. And one of the reasons that they want out is because the European Union wanted to open up its borders. We need to understand that when we hear these terms like open borders, these are terms that are being used all over Europe, and they have to do with fraternity and liberal constructs like free markets and things of this nature, where under the feudal system, we had the exact opposite. We had monopoly, right? We had mercantilism, and these were ideals that favored one industry over another. So we see Trump engaging in rhetoric that has to do with supporting what? The steel and aluminum industries. We see these types of things. We're seeing tariffs being imposed against China, the European Union, Mexico, and things of these nature. And these are the same things that happened up under the feudal system and those societies prior to World War I. So we're seeing history repeat itself. And Donald Trump is the face of global white supremacy. There's no doubt in my mind about that. For those of you more interested in that, go look up a document on the internet. It's called the European Declaration of Independence. And most of the things that you have heard me say there, I am just bringing that knowledge from that particular document. It is written by a gentleman who now is in prison for murdering 77 people. His name is Anders Breivik, I think his name is. He's a white supremacist from Norway, murdered 77 people, and he produced a 1,500-page document or manifesto called the European Declaration of Independence. It is anti-Muslim, it is anti-immigrant, it is very nationalistic, it is anti-women, it is anti-multiculturalism. We need to understand what these terms mean and contrast them to nationalism. Okay, multiculturalism. We're talking about multinational. We're talking about United Nations. We're talking about the European Union. These are multicultural, multinational organizations, and places like Britain. Boris Johnson, I think his name is, the new president there, is wanting to maintain Britain's border integrity, its culture, its place in history. He wants to maintain all of that. And at least from my standpoint, he wants to take them back to a time where these places were unchallenged. And so this is going on all over the world. We need to understand what's going on, because ultimately, during that period, prior to World War I, we know where the African countries were, and we know where we as ADOS were in position to all of that. We weren't playing much of a part in it. And so we should not want any of that, because it's detrimental to us from the standpoint of going back to an era which, at least for us, was the Jim Crow era.
Thank you, Marlon. Joel seems to vehemently disagree. You're wrong on that. Wrong on that, boo. No war, just control. Please research this. That's what they want us to believe. No WW3, just our world's dominance by the Chinese. China, hashtag China is the real enemy. China, 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 China. Forget white supremacy. The Chinese are laughing at us. We better get our head out of the European racism stuff. It's a new world order, and those tactics will not work in this new order. No one is afraid of the white man anymore.
Oh my God. Well, shit. Hey, Joel, you need to go back and look at your history books. This man started 2 world wars. I want you to name me one war that the Chinese have started. And even further, I want you to name me one time period where the Chinese have gotten on ships, have gotten into submarines, have gotten into transport planes, and went all over the world killing people. robbing them of their land and resources. I want you to name me one period in history in which China has done that, and then we can talk.
She's saying they don't want war, they want control through technology.
But war has benefits. The economy, at least the monopolies grow under war. And the United States was able to gain the advantage that it gained because it was, 6,000 miles away from Europe when the Germans decided to invade the number one ethnic group there, which were the Russians. So I don't understand that, how a world war started, or how world war started. And I don't, and the Chinese had no play in that. For the most part, they were, the Russians at the same time invaded China. The Russians, who were first enemies of China, are now allies with China because it sees the threat of NATO and, of course, the United States. NATO, what does that stand for? Let's think about the naming of that. The North American Treaty Alliance. Why is it called the North American Treaty Alliance? We find it called that because the European countries, which were destroyed, were dependent upon North America, namely the United States of America. And Trump is trying to destroy that fraternity of about 27 European nations, which stand to be invaded at any time by the Russians. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, Crimea, and things of these nature to prove my point. I mean, we need to go back. We need to read history. We need to be guided by it. We need to be informed by it instead of paying attention to these conspiracy theories and these authors and websites and blogs and things of these nature, where people that are just out trying to make a living, sensationalizing particular topics without giving them any, putting any academic rigor into their claims. So we need to make sure that we don't fall for that, because we will in turn turn around and fulfill the mission of the enemy. The enemy is to be against multiculturalism. Why would any Black person want to be engaged in a system that is against multiculturalism? Because we are the ones that are going to lose in a system that is anti-multicultural. So that's my claim on that one.
Okay, I'm going to read her last comment. She's like, the NATO is irrelevant in the New World Order.
Oh my
yes,
gosh.
The Chinese are directing all of what's happening in the Ukraine. And I want to go back to her earlier point. No land war, the new war on healthcare, technology, currency, wood, aluminum. Ain't nobody concerned about NATO. Then she says, call me.
Okay.
With that said, I think we're just so over. It's now 10:41. I want to thank you so much for your healthy exchange. It's been great to see you comment and be a part of this show. I want to thank our guest, Marlon Aldridge, who has been wonderful to do the show for me these past couple of weeks. I definitely want to have him back because I want to talk about reform, feudalism under capitalism. I want to delve into that topic, but that's going to be a whole nother show by itself. I think it's important for us to understand the white man. For us as ADOS, we need to understand, and we need to understand it from somebody who, like Marlon, is an academician, professor of physics and calculus at the collegiate level, and he's an avid researcher. So he's trying to teach me to be the same and get out of my emotions and come to the conversation with the data. And that I appreciate about his intellect and his contribution to the show. So with that said, family, I want to bid you all adieu. I want you to have a beautiful God-inspired rest of your Saturday. Please share this link make it go far and wide. We need people to turn their attention to this movement and what we're doing and the kind of obvious intellectual weight we have behind us to help us strategize to get reparations and an ADOS agenda. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to our next exchange next Saturday, 9 o'clock Pacific, 11 o'clock Central, and 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Ciao for now.